Welcome to UGC series of lectures in philosophy. Greek Philosophy, Part 13.
Dr. V. Chandrasekar is working as lecturer in philosophy in the Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda College since 1996. He has been awarded the degree of PhD by the University of Madras for his work in the area Yoga and Analytical Psychology. He has been teaching Indian philosophy, Western philosophy, and recent European philosophy for undergraduate and postgraduate students. He has participated in many seminars and presented papers in a variety of topics. He has also reviewed 2 books in Ethics and Indian Culture published by the Tamil Nadu Textbook Society for Plus 2 course.
Welcome to UGC series of lectures in philosophy. Greek Philosophy, Lecture 13. So far, I had told you about how the philosophers of the Greece were talking about what reality is, what its nature is, how the world has come into being, and all sorts of things. Of course, in the meantime, I also told you that the Greek philosophy, which is supposed to be the ancient philosophy in the West, can be divided into 3 periods. Namely, the Pre-Socratic period, the period in which we had the great philosophers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, that is the 2nd period, and of course, the post-Aristotelian period, which forms the 3rd period. So far, I was talking to you about the philosophies of Thales, Anaximenes, Anaximander, Pythagoras, Parmenides and others, who belong to the Pre-Socratic period, namely the 1st period. In the last class, I was talking to you about the philosophy of Anaxagoras. We can say that the 1st period of Greek philosophy ended with Anaxagoras, and we will be entering into the 2nd period of Greek philosophy, which can be termed as the mental and moral philosophy. Beginnings of mental and moral philosophies, Sophist, Socrates and others. Now, the 2nd period of Greek philosophy can be termed as the beginnings of mental and moral philosophy. Why? Because it was in the philosophy of Anaxagoras we came across a new principle, namely the principle of mind. He called it the nous, the intelligent principle. He used it in a very beautiful way to explain how the world could have come into being, because prior to him there was a dialogue with philosophers who tried to explain the origin of the world from some ultimate substance. But then Anaxagoras said that there is something ultimate, something that is permanent, yet which undergoes change. When we have this kind of understanding of something lying permanent but undergoing change, we need to know how it does, how it undergoes change. This is where he brings in a new principle called the mind, that introduced a new change in the understanding of the philosophers, and that is what we see here as the beginnings of mental and moral philosophies. Till such time these philosophers came, especially Sophists, Socrates and others, people were trying to analyze the reality, the world, what it is, how it is. But then from here we are going to see how philosophers understood man. That is why we can say that this particular period was dealing with man rather than with the world. We will be dealing with that portion now. Of course, we will be starting with Sophists and then moving across to Socrates and others. This period is very important in Greek philosophy, because this is the period where we had the philosophies of 3 great people, namely Socrates, his disciple Plato, and Aristotle, a disciple of Plato. That is why this is a very important period in Greek philosophy. In fact, whenever we talk of philosophy in the West, people are immediately reminded of these 3 greats. However, so far we saw who are all before these 3 people. Now we will be dealing with the period in which these 3 had come into existence. Now, as I told you earlier, we will be starting with the philosophy of Sophism. Sophists are a group of philosophers who were a bit prior to Socrates and contemporaneous to Socrates. Now, what is the sophism is? I was telling you about sophist, the philosophy is called sophism. What is this sophism is? Let us get the etymological meaning of the term sophism and then go into the exact philosophy of this group of philosophers. Meaning of sophism, the dictionary meaning, an online dictionary says sophism means expert or wise man. The Greek words sophos and sophia had the meaning of wise and wisdom since the time of the poet Homer. The word came to denote general wisdom and especially wisdom about human affairs in, for example, politics, ethics and household management. Look students, the term sophism itself literally means wise man. Why are they called wise? I think we can say that this is the group of people who are dealing with what was essential for man. So far, philosophy was dealing with what is essential, no doubt, but then while they were explaining what is essential, they were going into trans-empirical arena. But then here are a group of philosophers who are going to deal with what is practically needed for man. In fact, they are also going to talk of virtue, what is virtue for man, yet they are going to talk of it in terms of what a person does and not with respect to what he ought to attain. That is what we understand with respect to virtue, but then these people are going to give a new definition for virtue. That is why I said that these people are more practical, and that is what we saw in the last line. The word came to denote general wisdom and especially wisdom about human affairs, what it is to be man. We saw that of course people define man as a rational animal, social animal, etc., but then what is his role and what is the political scene in which he is, what is his role in ethics, what is his role in religion. This is what is to be understood, and wise man, that is the surface, we are trying to analyze man in all these angles. This is what sophism means. Now, an introduction before going into the philosophy of sophism, we will just see an introduction about it. While this first period ends with Anaxagoras, the second period begins with the sophists. Sophists denoted a class of intellectuals who taught courses in excellence or virtue, speculated about the nature of language and employed rhetoric. Now, as I told you earlier about the three periods, the first period comes to a close with Anaxagoras, because that is where we had the philosophers of Thales, Anaximenes and others coming to a close with respect to Anaxagoras. With respect to Thales, he was trying to analyze what the ultimate nature of the world is. Of course, was the case with other Milesian philosophers. But then with Parmenides, there was a discussion on what is being and what is becoming, what that is and what is becoming. But same time there was another philosopher called Heraclitus who was talking that there is only change. In order to reconcile this came other philosophers like Anaxagoras, who tried to talk of something that is permanent, but that is changing. Therefore, that is the end of the first period, and now starts the second period, where we are going to deal with not what the reality world is, but what man is. That is what we find with sophists, and sophists are generally denoted as a class of intellectuals who dealt with what is excellence and what is virtue. They were more interested in the language that man used, and they were interested in rhetoric. In fact, I can say that they were trying to express what was more in demand for man rather than what man ought to know. So far philosophy was trying to say what man ought to know, but here are a group of philosophers who are trying to see what is in demand with respect to man, because man basically uses language, and they were trying to actually, the sophists were trying to utilize their understanding of language and rhetoric for convincing others. That is the important feature of this kind of philosophers. Most of the views of surface are known today through the writings of Plato, Aristotle and others. Protagoras most famous, but includes Gorgias, Prodicus, Hippias, Thrasymachus and others. Now, how do we come to know the philosophy of the surface? As I told you earlier, which is the case with respect to other pre-Socratic thinkers, even the writings of the surface are not available to us, yet we come to know of their ideas through the writings of Plato, Aristotle and those philosophers who came after Aristotle. In fact, among the Greek philosophers, I had told you earlier that Socrates had not written any work by himself. Of course, others like Parmenides had written, but which are not available to us, only fragments of them are available, but we come to know of these philosophers through the writings of Plato and Aristotle. The same is the case with respect to surface. The philosophy of the surface are known to us through the writings of Plato, Aristotle and those philosophers who came after them. And there are sophism or to be precise, sophists refer to a group of philosophers. The first among them and the most important among them is Protagoras. Of course, this group of philosophers also includes Gorgias, Prodicus, Hippias, Thrasymachus and others. This is in general introduction to this kind of philosophy. Now, earlier philosophers on surface. Before understanding the philosophy of surface, it is better that we know where they stand in the history of Greek philosophy. I told you earlier that they belong to the second period, or we can say that the beginning of second period started with the philosophy of sophism. But then it is important for us to know what their philosophy is in relation to what philosophies were there before them. Let me just go through them now. Introduction of the discussion on antithesis of corporeal mind and matter in Anaxagoras. Number 2, origin of the world, that is the first period, as against position of man, second period, and then cosmology of earlier philosophers, whereas the humanistic approach of surface. Now, when we try to understand the surface, the philosophy of the surface, we should know where they stand. Before doing that, we should understand what were available before them, and that is what I read out just now in the slide, wherein I pointed out about the introduction of the antithesis between mind and matter in the philosophy of Anaxagoras. We all know in the earlier class I was talking to you about the philosophy of Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras, while trying to reconcile the philosophy of Parmenides and Heraclitus, who are maintaining two different views, namely one of them was maintaining the view that something is permanent in this world, and Heraclitus was maintaining that there is nothing permanent in this world. In order to reconcile these two views, Anaxagoras comes with a new theory by stating that there are certain eternal things, but which undergo change. While talking of eternal things undergoing change, one is forced to ask, how did this change come into picture when they are eternal, and that is where he brings in the concept of mind. Of course, before him we had Empedocles who spoke of love and hate, which is responsible for the eternal elements coming together. But then this element of mind brings in a new area of discussion in philosophy, namely the antithesis between corporeal matter and incorporeal mind. That is, it brings in the discussion between matter and mind, to put it simply. That was the state in which we should first try to understand the surface, the philosophy of the surface. Secondly, I told you earlier that sophism represents the beginnings of the second period of Greek philosophy. Why? In the first period of Greek philosophy, there were two kinds of thought, namely one which dealt with the origin of the world, we call it as the cosmology. On the other hand, there was the discussion on being and becoming with respect to Parmenides and Heraclitus. So, that characterized the philosophy of the first period. However, in the second period, namely which starts with surface, we are going to deal with what man is, who man is. In fact, in order to just put it in beforehand, let me tell you, when we deal with Socrates, we are going to come across one particular statement, namely know thyself. Socrates was famous for saying know thyself, because he said that he is doing philosophy in order for man to conduct himself in the world. So, that is the idea with which we must understand the second period. Therefore, while first period dealt with origin of the world and discussion on being and becoming, the second period was dealing with the position of man in the universe. And lastly, there was another important thing, namely the cosmology of earlier philosophers as against the humanistic approach of the surface. We saw earlier that the first period philosophers were concerned with how the world came into existence, but surfism is going to talk of what man is in this world. They are not going to say why man has come into picture or how man has come into picture, but then they are going to talk of what man is, what is his status. They are going to talk about it. That is why we called it as the humanistic attitude or approach of the surface. Understanding the times, religious, political and social conditions of the surface in order to understand their philosophy. The times, rise of democracy and decay of religion. Now, before understanding the philosophy of surface, it is proper for us to know the time in which this kind of philosophy came into picture. The religious, political and social conditions are always the background in which any kind of philosophy come into picture. If Thales and Anaximenes and Anaximander were dealing with what the ultimate nature of world is, they at times wanted them to talk on those lines. But then if sophists are going to talk of what man is, instead of talking how the world came into being, it all depends upon the religious, social and political conditions of that time. In fact, I am going to say later on, there was a decay of religion among the Greek thought at that particular point of time and rise of democracy on the other hand. These are two things which we saw in the second point with respect to the slide. Two important features of this particular period is rise of democracy on the one hand, combined with the rise of philosophy and science and the decay of religion. What is this decay of religion? Who is responsible for it? Let us see that now. In fact, I told you in our earlier classes with respect to Xenophanes and others, like for example Democritus and all. Of course, we did not do Democritus directly, but then we made mentions about some philosophers who spoke about gods, the Greek gods. The conception of God in Greek mythologies and the conception given by the poets were not taken in the right sense by the people, in the sense whatever bad was found in man could be equally found with respect to the characterization of gods in the mythologies or by the poets. So, whatever wrong deeds we do, we could always say that yes, this god did that or that god did that. So, this was one of the reason why religion had to face decay on the one hand. On the other hand, the decay of religion is also due to the rise of philosophy. What was once considered to be acts of divine will were expressed by philosophers and scientists as being due to natural causes. This we saw when we spoke about a particular theory, namely the transition from metaphysics to positive sciences with respect to the atomists and others. I was dealing with earlier up till Anaxagoras, where we saw how the philosophers were trying to express the reality in terms of natural causes. So, that was another cause for decay of religion. So, on the one hand the characterization of gods by the poets and mythologists, and on the other hand the rise of philosophy and science, which are trying to give understandings through natural causes. This was the cause for decay of religion on the one hand. And then I was also talking to you about rise of democracy. What is this democracy? Students, one reminder here, you should not understand democracy as we understand it today. Today we all know that democracy is taken to be a government by the people, of the people, for the people, where it is a kind of representative government. But then the democracy that is spoken of in Greece is not, was actually it is not, is, was not like that, in the sense that earlier on Greece was not a single nation. Each city or each hamlet was a country by itself. It had its own laws, its own legislations and its own governments. So, each hamlet may even comprise of a handful of persons, but then each one was empowered to legislate and bring out laws by themselves, and those laws were governing upon them. Since there was no one unified country like Greece that we have now, and since each hamlet was a government by itself, the democracy that was found there was not similar to what we find now in India, for example, or in other countries, for example. So, as a result, each individual was a law unto himself, or became a law unto himself. I should not say was, but became a law unto himself. That was the problem which the Greeks faced. Rise of democracy leading to egoism, selfishness and forgetting the interests of the nation. Yes, this I mentioned, decay of religion due to conception of gods by mythologists and poets, man's dependence on philosophy, on science. Now, coming to the second point, of course, I have mentioned earlier. Now, coming to the first point, rise of democracy. I said that leads to egoism, selfishness and forgetting the interests of the nation. What does it mean? When I say that each small hamlet is a small country and has a particular government by itself, what happened was it led to partisan views of the individuals. When we have representatives, we will have one person representing the whole set of group falling in a particular place, but then if there is going to be only 10 people and all 10 people are going to lead, then everybody is going to give their own interests. So, as a result, what happens is, in the case of representation, the person who is representing cannot give his views, he has to give the views of all the people whom he is representing. But then if I am going to be alone, there is always a possibility of me giving my own views, and that leads to partisan interests or selfish interests. That is what I meant by leading to egoism, selfishness and forgetting the interests of the nations. Now, when I am going to present my interests in the forefront, naturally the interests of the nation will recede to the background. This is one of the major point that was found during the time of the Sophists. And now, as I told you earlier, Sophists were interested in dealing with what virtue is, in giving definition of what virtue or excellence is. Now, if you really look into this background, you will understand why they were talking about excellence and virtue rather than about what reality is. What they see, what they are going to say, we will be dealing in the few classes we are going to have in the future. But before that, let me summarize as to what we have done so far. However, what I have done so far is only with respect to understanding what the Sophists are going to say in respect to the time in which they belong. What they have said we will be dealing with later, but what we did so far, let me just summarize now. We just saw the meaning of Sophism. We also saw Sophism as against earlier philosophies, situation in which Sophism arose. Of course, last point, discussion on who the Sophists are and what their philosophy is. This particular point we have to deal with in detail more. And now, with respect to model questions, what the questions that you can expect. Analyze the contribution of the Sophists in the light of their predecessors. What are the conditions in which Sophism should be understood? Explain. In conclusion, students, I should tell you that so far I have spoken about the background in which the philosophy of Sophism arose. However, what their philosophy is, what their contribution is, we will be dealing with later. But then this becomes a kind of an introduction or forms a platform for us to understand the philosophy of Sophism, and that is where this particular lecture will be very, very useful, because in order to know a particular philosophy, it is always better that we know its origin, the reasons for it to have come, and in that sense this class will be very useful. We will continue with the understanding the surface and how they shaped the philosophy of their period, including that of Socrates and others, in the following classes to come. Thank you.